nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prananatha pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vidashodjitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Kathamaham Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoyer yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Brajalokavad Gurutara Prem Naivatasya Namah Yaramya Nikilarta Yaramya Nikilaga Shanga Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular, we're continuing with the second of two verses in this section on Bhagavad Dharma Tattva. And so we'll conclude that section today, and we'll probably start into the next one as well. So, in our last discussion, we concluded the lengthy analysis of the previous verse, finalizing with the subject matter of how various devatas are to be respected by followers of the path of Vaishnava Dharma, or how Bhagavan's bhaktas will also see and honor the various other devatas. So, having explained those aspects of Bhagavad Dharma, now another aspect is presented in the following verse. So this is verse 115. Next, Sri Rupapad cites a statement from the Agamas that describes how Bhagavad Dharma, illustrated through mention of 5 forms of worship of Sri Bhagavan, can destroy even the 5 most severe types of sin, or mahapatakas, that is, causes of degradation. So the word pataka is used in Smriti Shastra and in general to refer to something that's considered forbidden and a consequence of later degradation or detriment to oneself, or what is loosely equivalent to what they call in English sin. However, it's nice to note also that the word pataka literally means what causes one to fall, or in other words, what brings one down or degrades oneself. So this verse that we'll read is composed as I won't say a play upon, but it's composed as, you could say, a response to the general understanding of what are the most severe types of sins. So it's exalting Bhagavad Dharma by, as it's mentioned here, saying that it can destroy even the 5 most severe types of sin. So it's written for an audience who are well acquainted with the statements in the Smriti and elsewhere that list these severe types of sin. So when they hear this verse, then they immediately can understand the structure and why it's being composed as it is. So the verse is as follows. Hatyāṁ hanti yad-aṅghri-saṅga-tulasī steyaṁ toyaṁ pade naivedyaṁ bahu-madya-pāna-duritaṁ gurv-aṅganā-saṅgajam śrīśādhīna-matiḥ sthitir hari-janais tat-saṅgajaṁ kilbiṣaṁ śālagrāma-śilā-nṛsiṁha-mahimā lokottaraḥ. Tulasi, attached to whose feet, destroys the sin produced by murder. Water from whose feet destroys the sin produced by stealing. Offerings to whom destroy the sin of copiously drinking wine. The mind dwelling on the Lord of Śrī dispels that sin which is produced by intercourse with the Guru's wife, and abiding with Hari's servants destroys the sin produced by association with them, that is, those who commit the 4 aforementioned types of sin. This sort of extraordinary greatness of Nṛsiṁha in the form of a śālagrāma-śilā is beyond this world. So there's a mapping or a mention of certain types of bhakti-yogas are mentioned to parallel to show a certain contrast with the various types of sin. So to murder someone, in some cases, or maybe more so in earlier ages, had to do with striking the body of the person. So just attaching a tulsi leaf to the feet of Bhagavan can destroy even the consequence of having attacked or struck the body of another person. And then here it's saying that the water from whose feet can destroy the act of stealing. So perhaps the sense there is that, usually the water that's used to wash someone's feet is, kept outside and, the last thing anyone would ever want to take, so to speak. But in the case of Bhagavan or a great Mahatma, to, collect that or to honor that or to, value that, is said to counteract even the act of stealing. And perhaps also this comparison is made, if you look in the end of the first line, it says steyaṁ cha toyaṁ, that he may have also wanted to bring a little alliteration out. The word toyaṁ means water, so that may also be a reason why he paired these two. And then offerings are said to counteract the act of drinking wine. So to honor prasad or to give something to eat to Bhagavan, this can be considered, parallel to, or the ultimate opposite of consuming wine or consuming intoxicants oneself. And then to think of the Lord of Śrī, or to think of Bhagavan, who's the Lord of Lakshmi, produces the sin, destroys the sin produced by intercourse with the guru's wife. So that's, classically, gurus were typically grihastas, and it would be, the worst of offenses to, approach the wife of the guru while one was living at the guru's home or studying in the guru's home as a student. So, to think of, rather than for the mind to go to, that woman, rather to think of he who is, the Lord of the most beautiful of women, or the ultimate woman, Lakshmi Devi, then this will have some, reversal or some parallel opposite, so to speak. And then similarly, to associate with Vaishnavas is paired with the act of associating with sinners. So there's some intentional juxtaposition of these things. But even though such juxtapositions are made, the sense isn't that if someone doesn't offer tulsi to the feet of Bhagavan, that their sin of murder can't be cancelled. Rather, any act of bhakti has that power. The intended sense is not that only these specific acts counteract only these specific sins, and then someone gets into some calculative, attempt at prayaschitta or atonement. This is not the intended sense, but rather, in a poetic or a playful way, these things are being juxtaposed, ultimately for the sake of exalting the value of worshipping Bhagavan in his deity form, or more broadly, simply following Bhagavad Dharma with the understanding that can absolve someone of all the past sins one has committed. So this is something that is important. Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, when he is explaining the greatness of bhakti at the very beginning of the text, the very first thing he mentions is that the characteristic of bhakti that he mentions is that it's kleshagni, or it's a removal of afflictions. And it's widely understood that afflictions are caused by one's own past transgressions or sins, so that bhakti has the power to negate the consequences of those past actions means that it has the ability to remove the sufferings or the difficulties that one might undergo. So that's one of the extraordinary features of the nature of Bhagavad Dharma. So that's the topic here, Bhagavad Dharma Tattva. So why is Rupa Goswami citing this verse here? To show that part of the essential nature of bhakti or Bhagavad Dharma is that it has the power to absolve someone of sin. And you could take that in kind of a judicial karmic sense, that there was some thing on your record and it got wiped from your record or something like that. But another way of seeing it is more in a practical psychological way, that when one's mind is absorbed in bhakti, then the samskars for bhakti are being nourished, and the samskars for these other unfavorable activities are waning away. So that's also a very relevant aspect of what's being pointed to by this verse. So let's look at a few points of reference regarding this. So just some evidence from the Shruti and the Smriti for this list of 5 sins. So in the Chandogya Upanishad, it is said, a thief of gold, a drinker of wine, a dweller in the Guru's bed, that is, an adulterer with the Guru's wife, and a killer of a Brahmana. These 4, that is, those who commit the 4 aforementioned, sins, and a 5th who associates with them, fall. And then an example from the Smriti Shastra, a Brahmana killer, a wine drinker, a thief, a goer to the Guru's bed, they are great sinners, as is one who shall associate with them. Thus, the mention in the verse under discussion of, quote, murder, can be understood to refer even to the murder of a Brahmana, which is regarded as a greater crime than murdering a non-brahmana in classical, smriti-based jurisprudence. Stealing, similarly, can be understood to refer even to the sin of stealing gold, which is a greater wrong than stealing items of lesser value. Offerings refers to mahaprasad, and the mention of a śālagrāma-śilā can be taken to refer to deity forms of Bhagavan in general. In other words, sometimes people worship one form of Bhagavan, but then when they're scared or they're in danger, then they go worship Nrsimhadev. And I'm not gonna rain on anyone's parade if that's what they wish to do, but it's not that that's essential, or arguably it's not an ideal form of ishta-nishta, or fixity in one's ishta devata. If one has full fixity, full sharanagati to one's ishta devata, then why would in the moment of danger one go off to some other form of Bhagavan? Why wouldn't one have full confidence in one's ishta devata to look after and have full protection for oneself? So the mention here of a śālagrāma-śilā of Nrsimhadev, we don't need to take that as, okay, if I committed one of these sins, that I better do Nrsimha Śālagrāma puja. That's not the intended sense. Rather, that example is being given, or an illustration is being given, but any form of Śālagrāma, any form of Bhagavan's, the worship of any such form has such power. So the purport of the verse is that the 5 forms of bhakti mentioned in the verse, as well as any and all other forms of bhakti, whereby the otherworldly greatness of Sri Bhagavan is evoked into manifestation, have the power to purify someone of even the most severe forms of sin. The commentator adds, however, that this is the case only if these sins are committed without premeditated intent, to use the power of worship of Sri Bhagavan as a means to purify oneself of the sins one has committed. If one commits these sins on the strength of the great power to purify, possessed by a Nrsimha Śālagrāma-śilā, or any other deity form of Sri Bhagavan, or any other form of bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, like chanting his name, then an offense to the name ensues, rather than purification of one's sin. So we discussed this earlier. See the mention of the 7th offense to Sri Bhagavan's name in the commentary on Padyavali 31 for further discussion of this subject. So we don't need to revisit that. In other words, if one tries to use an act of bhakti as a means to purify oneself of sin, that's disrespectful to bhakti, and it's disrespectful to the object of bhakti, because the purpose of bhakti is not just, cleaning off your record, so to speak, but the purpose of bhakti is actually to honor and please Bhagavan. So to misuse that act for a different purpose than what it's meant for is to go against it, or apa-radha, or to go what is contrary to aradhana, or propitiation of the object. So the ultimate import of the verse under discussion is that worship of Sri Bhagavan by way of offering tulsi to his feet and so on is always to be done with sincere intent, meaning it is, to be done for the sake of serving and satisfying Sri Bhagavan, and not merely for the sake of absolving oneself of sin. So Rupa Goswami does spend time on showing the greatness of bhakti in this respect, here in this citation as well as in the opening chapter of the Sindhu, as I mentioned. But it's not that by mentioning that bhakti has such greatness that he in any way intends that people think, oh, okay, then I'll use bhakti to achieve that effect. That's not his purpose in presenting such analysis. Rather, to convey to people the great power of bhakti, the greatness of bhakti. That's why such points are made. Similarly, there's a long discussion of such things in Hari-bhakti Vilas. So, like this, the section on Bhagavad Dharma Tattva concludes. Just 2 verses. Here in the Padyavali, Rupa Goswami is not focused on that side of things. He's dealt with that in much more detail. in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. For the most part, he's focusing more on the kavya side of things and the exaltation of the sentiments of bhaktas, and the leelas and the rasas of Braj is by far the main subject matter here in the text. So he just has a very brief token mention of some aspects of Bhagavad Dharma Tattva, and we can say that he included these two verses to give some general attention to that subject briefly, and also because they both of the verses have some fine poetic manner of composition. So now we come to the next section. Next, the compiler begins a new section related to the third form of bhakti mentioned in the previous verse, that is, making offerings of food to Sri Bhagavan. So we don't see here in the Padyavali much praising of specific acts of bhakti. We did hear about kirtan and Krishna Katha early on, and Krishna's name, but other than that, we hear, we heard about dainya, we heard about nishta, we heard about, what was it? What was the third one? Utsukya. But perhaps the only kind of prasanga sangati that I see in this case is just that there's a mention of offering in the previous verse, so he is inclined to say a few things about acts of offering. And so he has 3 verses on this subject matter. And then after that, from following this section, the whole rest of the text starts exclusively praise and discussion of Braj. So this is perhaps just something he was fond of and wanted to include, and the first couple of verses that he cites are undoubtedly charming, and then following the first 2, he writes one of his own to complement that, which comes to kind of cap off the section, and also is very much indicative of his own personal manner of worship, so we'll get to that in time. So we'll look first at the opening verse of the section. So ata naivedyaṁ vigyapti. Now, entreaties for presenting an offering of foods. So in other words, when one is making an offering to the deity, then these are prayers that can be offered at that time. So this first one, it says, is by Ramanuja. Now I did a bit of digging, and I couldn't find any evidence that this is by Ramanuja, meaning Ramanuja Acharya. So if ever someone can find this piece in Ramanuja's writings, that would be great. Please let me know. But to my knowledge, it's not by the famous Ramanuja Acharya of Srirangam, but rather another poet of, prior to the era of Rupa Goswami, who was also named Ramanuja. So he writes as follows: dvija-strīṇāṁ bhakte mṛduni vidurānne vraja-gavāṁ dadikshire sakyu sputakshipita mushto muraripo yashodaya stanye vraja yuvati datte madhunite yatasi damodas tadayamupa hari-pikurutam. O enemy of Mura, as you felt delight in the meal of the Brahmana's wives, the moderate food of Vidura, the yogurt and milk of Braja's cows, the palmful of broken flat rice from your friend, the breast milk of Yashoda, and the sweets offered by the young girls of Braja, may you do so in this offering as well. So I got a little inspired on this one, so I have some commentary which will follow, which refers to the sections in the Bhagavatam where some of these leelas are mentioned, or Mahabharata, or where they're found. So we'll give a little attention to this, so to speak. And but to start, what I have today is not specifically speaking about these examples, but rather to the act of offering food and how it is that Bhagavan delights in that or take pleasures in that. So the prayer is, as you delighted in these offerings of all these great parikaras and bhaktas, may you also delight in this offering of mine. In other words, may you also be pleased with my offering. So how and why is Bhagavan pleased by the offerings of his bhaktas? Today we'll have some discussion of this sublime subject. So, in this verse, a bhakta named Ramanuja cordially entreats Sri Bhagavan to accept an offering of food. Quote, O Krishna, as you felt delight in the meal offered to you by the Brahmana's wives and in the offerings of others, so may you within my meditation also delight in this offering presented by me. So this is how the commentator summarizes the gist of it. And it's just coming to my mind, I don't think I have it here, but you could perhaps also add here that in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, where Sanatana Goswami Pad speaks about the process of offering, he, in the course of doing so, makes an elaborate description which makes mention of meditating that the mouth of the deity opens in front of the offering, and then fire descends out of the mouth of the deity and consumes the offering, and then Amrita is released and it reconstitutes the offering as it was before, and this kind of elaborate process like this, involving various mudras and all these things. And then after mentioning all that, he says that those who are akantik bhaktas, or those who are focused Krishna bhaktas, they won't do any of this. And he says, rather, they will make an offering to Krishna, meditating on his manjul vyavahar, or his charming behavior in Braj. So, here, when this verse is saying, or when the commentator rather is saying, may you within my meditation also delight in this offering presented by me, then we can take it with also reference to Sanatana Goswami's point that this meditation will be constituted of the Krishna of Braja delighting in this offering in that context of his Braja Lila. So, the examples of the Brahmana's wives and so forth are all mentioned in the verse so as to illuminate the principle, as was discussed in Padyavali 8 and elsewhere, that Sri Bhagavan is satisfied only by bhakti, and not rather by any distinguishing quality that may be present in any particular article offered to him. So when he's saying, please delight in my offering, the way you delighted in the rice from Sudama or the food from Vidura, the idea is that may I make this offering with bhakti, or may this offering be an act of bhakti such that you are delighted. Not that he's thinking, oh, I've cooked so perfectly that you're going to like the food, but rather that it's understood, all these examples, the Brahmana's wives, Vidura, the cows of Braja, etc., that they all have profoundly relishable bhakti for Bhagavan. And it's really the bhakti that Bhagavan is relishing that's manifest in the form of the offering. So that point will elucidate now. So the author's intent in this prayer is thus that he may make an offering to Sri Bhagavan that is replete with bhakti. Since Sri Bhagavan will most assuredly take pleasure in any foods he offers when he succeeds in offering them with bhakti. Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself affirms this in Bhagavad Gita 9:26. Patram pushpam phalam toyaṁ yome bhaktya prayachati tadaham bhakti paritam ashnami prayatatmanaha. One who with bhakti offers a leaf, flower, fruit, or water to me, I partake of that offered out of bhakti from one of pure heart. So So this is a very well-known verse, very dear to so many. So we'll look at how some of the commentators have illuminated the meaning of this verse. Sri Samipad and Sri Chakravartipad following him comment in regard to this verse that Bhagavan Sri Krishna's intent here is to show that bhakti to himself is easy to perform in comparison to worship of other devatas, which typically requires expensive paraphernalia and difficult to accomplish rites. So, if we consider the context of this statement, the previous verse in the Gita, where he says, Devan yanti vraja devan bhutani yanti bhuteja, how does it go? Mad prataya janti mam. I forget the verse, but where he's saying, those who worship the devas go to the devas, those who worship the spirits go to the spirits, those who worship me come to me. So he's making a distinction between worship of himself and worshipping of all these others. And the verse previous to that, aham hi sarva yajnanam bhoktacha prabhurevacha, that I am the supplier and the provider of the result of all yajnas. So in that context, the way Samipad and Chakravartipad are reading it is that Krishna is alluding to the performance of yajna for various devatas and the rites performed for worship of various spirits and other persons. So compared to just offering one leaf or some water or a fruit, those other processes which involve, elaborate recitation of mantras and strict rules regarding how the rituals are performed, saying that if you have bhakti and you just offer me a leaf, I'm happy. This is, spoken in stark contrast, or that this seems really exceptionally simple in comparison to the other types of yajna or puja that are being referred to in the context. So, drawing from that import out of the statements made in context, then here the commentators are saying that Krishna wants to say that if you worship me, you come to me. In other words, you get something better than by what you get by worshipping others. And worshipping me is easy compared to worshipping those others in terms of the literal procedure of how it's performed. So that's one aspect of the import. Sri Baladev illuminates the import of the verse as follows. So it, namely bhakti, is fit to be performed also because of its being easily accomplishable. Patram, he speaks this verse. So what's the import of this verse? Not only by bhakti do you get a higher result, but the process of doing bhakti is easier than these other things too. This is how he's seeing the intent. So one who with bhakti, that is, with an abundance of love, offers me, the Ishvara of everything, a leaf, or a flower, or any other easily attainable item, I partake of, that is, I enjoy as appropriate, that item offered out of bhakti, meaning offered out of love. From him, even though I am possessed of all variegated infinite magnificences, and am of fulfilled desire in and of my own self. Or, the sense is that I become filled with hunger and thirst produced in me by that love of my bhakta, and out of absorption in his bhakti, I eat all of that. That is, everything that my bhakta offers me, be it something conventionally considered edible, like a fruit, or not, like a flower. So I've got that in brackets. That's not just me tooting my horn here, but that's actually how other commentators have added to this verse in other places. So we'll look at that later. But I thought I would just add it in here too. So that's right. Krishna will even eat a flower if it's offered to him with bhakti, even though you don't usually eat flowers. And that doesn't only just mean, nasturtiums or certain flowers that are known to be edible, like what you call in English the honeysuckle flowers, even other flowers. So here there's some, significant, theological points being made. So, And before that, also, there's a matter of hermeneutics where Baladeva is saying that the mention of a leaf, fruit, flower, or water, then is that an exclusive list or is that an inclusive list? In other words, do we take it that Krishna is saying, if you offer me a fruit, a flower, water, or a leaf, I accept it. But if you offer me a root, then I won't. Is that the sense that this is what he said? He said these 4 things. Why are you offering something else? Rather, no. The list is representative and meant to convey the idea that he'll accept anything that's even something that's easily attainable. But not anything, I mean, not literally that you'll offer him wine or you'll offer him that's something that's, quote, amadya, or unfit to be offered, but among all that is fit to be offered, even things or whatever things are easily available to you, that he will accept. So this is how he interprets the significance of the list. And then saying that when this is offered to me out of bhakti, which he interprets to mean love or priti here. I think he says the word priti. Yeah. Or you could take it priti also as affection here. That Bhagavan becomes filled with hunger and thirst by that love. In other words, that love enkindles in him appetite to take that. He doesn't have any appetite for that, as he's atmaram aptakam. He's fulfilled in and of himself, but yet love can instill in him the desire to partake and a feeling of joy in doing so. So here also what's really being exalted is both the profound transcendental nature of bhakti, as well as Bhagavan's nature as a rasika, or as a relisher of the sweetness of bhakti, or the essence of bhakti, that this really is what is most satisfying to him. And as Jiva Goswami has dealt with elsewhere, because that bhakti that enkindles this desire in him and produces this pleasure in him and partaking of this offering from the other is actually a previously transmitted dispensation of his own Sarup Shakti, there's no ontological contradiction to this idea that he's self-satisfied or he's fulfilled in and of himself. Rather, he's imbuing this aspect, this loving aspect of himself into the other, and then relishing the reflection of that aspect of himself back towards him through the prism or the mirror, if you will, of that bhakta. So, one may wonder in this regard, of what nature is he, that is the bhakta said to offer a leaf or otherwise in the verse? Thus, he says, quote, from one of pure heart, prayatmanaha. That is, from one of fully purified mind, meaning one who is desireless, nishkama, or a desireless bhakta. So here's the kicker, or in other words, if we read this verse to say, oh yeah, it's so easy, you just offer anything you have, whatever is easily available, and Bhagavan will be happy. Well, yes, but he'll be happy to the extent that the person doing that is nishkama, or free from, motivations other than bhakti. In other words, really if you're offering out of bhakti, he'll be very satisfied. But if you're offering it tainted by other interests and motivations, then he won't be so satisfied. So, also a point that we've stressed many times, that purity and desirelessness of objects other than bhakti, these two things are spot-on equivalent in the view of the Gaudiya Acharyas. So, how Jiva Goswami dealt with some of the statements of Prahlad that we dealt with earlier regarding the 4th verse of the Shikshastakam, and which also relate to that aspect of the definition of sadhana bhakti that we discussed recently, sadhya bhava, that for bhakti to qualify as sadhana, it must be for the aim of bhava, which means it can't be tainted by pursuit of other objects, or which betrays the presence of other desires. So purity and desirelessness are equivalent, therefore contamination and desire are equivalent, therefore desire is impurity. So what makes someone prayataha, or pure, that the relative degree of their desire for bhakti or desire for other things. So consequently, furthermore, I partake of that which is offered to me by one who is desireless and devoted to me, whereas I do not partake of that which is offered by someone opposite to that. This is stated in the verse. So when he mentions this part, this is, you could say, sort of an excluding characteristic. In other words, he's satisfied with anything offered out of bhakti by one whose mind is desireless, because one's offering will really be out of bhakti when one has no other desires. Or in other words, when one's mind is pure. So that he will be satisfied with. So the idea is, by putting that point at the end, prayatatmanaha, that he's implying that to really please him and to really make an offering with bhakti, one has to be of purified mind. The apparently redundant statement, quote, offered out of bhakti, bhakti uparitam, made even after saying with bhakti earlier in the verse, indicates that bhakti alone is satisfying to me, and not rather anyone's merely being a twice-born, being an ascetic, or otherwise. So the verse does seem to have some redundancy in it when he says in the first line, bhaktya prayachati, offered with bhakti, or out of bhakti, and then in the second line when he says bhakti uparitam, or something offered out of bhakti, if he's saying offer with bhakti, and then when that offering out of bhakti comes, it's like, why do you have to say it twice? So the commentator is illuminating why the repetition is there. In other words, that Krishna wants to emphasize that it's bhakti that pleases him, that the person should offer it with bhakti, and then it's that bhakti upahrita, it's that offering out of bhakti that has pleased him, not the offering. So he's putting it in compound with bhakti, that it's a bhakti offering that he's partaking of, not an offering that he's partaking of. So by using that word twice and introducing what can appear to be redundancy, rather there's a stress on the primary import of the verse, which is that Bhagavan is satisfied by bhakti. So which is to say that you might be a rishi, or you might be a twice-born Brahmin, and you might be conducting yajna and what have you, but Bhagavan's not really going to be pleased by that if it's devoid of bhakti. So, Sri Jivapad also comments in regard to this verse in his Bhakti Sandarbha, that the desire to receive services offered by bhaktas, such as being fed, bathed, and banned, which Bhagavan feels, is entirely genuine, meaning it is not in any way artificial, and it arises from the bhakti his bhaktas foster for him. So this is a nice point. In other words, is it that he's just being nice? Or in other words, if you visit some family, they have some young children, the parents are trying to teach the young children manners, and the young children, try to make some gesture of respect, or, stumblingly make some, statement of respect or something like that. And to encourage the child, you say, oh yes, thank you, very good, or something like this, where it's not that the act in and of itself, although, a young child's activity might be naturally endearing, but it's not that the expertise with which the action was performed, the excellence of the action, is really praiseworthy as such, but nevertheless you show acknowledgement to it, or you recognize it, because you want to be supportive or kind to the child. So is it like that? Is it that Bhagavan, he's satisfied in himself, he doesn't really need any of these things, but just to keep these, bhaktas down there in, samsara happy, oh, very good, yes, very nice. Is he, sort of being like a putting on an encouraging act, if you will? No. Rather, according to Jiva Goswami, that, Bhagavan, the desire that Bhagavan has for this is entirely genuine, meaning he actually relishes this, he actually wants this, he actually values this, and when he receives it, he actually feels joy to get it, the way you feel the joy of getting a desire fulfilled. So both the desire, the pleasure of the experience, and then the effects of that pleasure, the anubhavas or sattvika bhavas that he may express, none of this is an act. This is real, so to speak. Sri Ramanuja Acharya also describes this in his commentary on the aforesaid verse from Bhagavad Gita. So I went a little extra here. I don't always add the Gita commentaries of other acharyas, but in this case I found Ramanuja Acharya's commentary quite nice, so, and on theme with the way Jiva Goswami dealt with it, so I brought that also here. So he gives it as follows. One who with bhakti offers me a leaf that is easily available for everyone, or a flower, or a fruit, or water, which is also easily available for everyone. One whose sole aim is offering such to me, by virtue of being devoid of ability to sustain oneself without doing that, on account of profound fondness for me, and who as such offers me a leaf or otherwise. So this is, it sounds maybe a little bit long in English, but what he's saying is that when you really desire to do something, you can't not do it. In other words, you can't contain yourself, or sometimes in English we say, I couldn't help myself. I just bought a whole new box of chocolates. Where'd they go? I couldn't help myself. I just ate them all. Where it's out of intense desire for something that you do something, you can't stop yourself from doing it. So he's saying that these bhaktas, they have such priyata, or such fondness, or such love for Bhagavan that they can't not offer him something. Not that by discipline or repetition or routine they go about this, but rather they can't contain themselves. That's all they want to be doing. That's what they're so eager to be doing. They can't not offer what they have to him. So when such a bhakta, in such a manner, offers whatever they have that's easily available to me with bhakti, then how does Bhagavan respond? It says, I, the Ishvara of everything, I whose Leela is the emanation, projection, and dissolution of the entire universe, I whose every desire is fulfilled, I whose resolve is ever true, I who am replete with uncountable, infinite, preeminent, auspicious qualities. Although abiding in the midst of my own experience of the infinite, preeminent bliss produced by my own nature, I, as if attaining something pleasing that was far beyond the scope of my desires, partake of that leaf or otherwise, so offered to me out of bhakti, for me, from one who is of pure heart. In other words, he's stressing the ontological nature of Bhagavan here as being Atmaram, Aptakam, etc. That he's, abiding always in an infinite degree of preeminent bliss that's just coming from his own nature. And yet still, he partakes of this as if he's getting something better than he ever hoped he would get. That he's surprised, in other words. He's experiencing chamatkar, he's experiencing the essence of rasa, he's experiencing the delight of having something exceed even the desire that he had when he receives even these incredibly simple things from his bhaktas. You might think, okay, maybe Bhagavan could be impressed if someone, gave him a whole universe or something. But here it's saying that Bhagavan is, exceeding what he could expect in satisfaction is being felt just by being given the simplest thing that can be found. So therefore, what's ultimately being exalted by all this description is the relishable nature of bhakti for both Bhagavan and his bhakta. As well as, we can say, come on, the sweet, simple nature of just making offerings. And how this, you could say, very plain, human scale, expression has such an endearing nature. So, Sri Chakravarti Pad also comments in regard to the notion of, quote, from one of pure heart, that no one other than a bhakta is fit to be regarded as truly of purified psyche, and that the inability to relinquish the service of Sri Krishna's feet is an indicative characteristic of purity of the psyche, as is taught in the Bhagavad 2.8.6, quote, a person of purified psyche does not give up the soles of Krishna's feet. So why does the mind go where it goes? It goes there because of the samskaras that are edged into the citta, because of the inclinations and desires that people have. So, hereby saying, a person of purified psyche does not give up the soles of Krishna's feet. When the mind is purified, the mind won't ever stray from Krishna, because what causes the mind to stray from Krishna? Impurity. What is impurity? Samskaras for other things, desires for other things. So when the mind is purified of those non-bhakti samskaras, then the mind just sits and remains fixed on Krishna's feet. So Chakravartipad is bringing this point to say that, quote, to be of pure heart means to be a bhakta. And to be a bhakta means one doesn't stray from engagement in bhakti. And a bhakta doesn't leave bhakti because a bhakta's mind is purified of everything but bhakti. So this builds on topics that we discussed earlier. I will further elaborate on that. So Bhagavan Sri Krishna speaks further about the satisfaction he feels in receiving offerings from his bhaktas in his teachings in regard to ritual worship, in his celebrated dialogue with Sri Uddhava in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, even water, that is the simplest thing offered to me with Shraddha by my bhakta, is most dear. Even a great lavish offering from a non-bhakta, however, leads to no satisfaction for me. And what's more of fragrances, incense, flowers, lamps, food, and so on. So in other words, if my bhakta gives me something, even the simplest thing, I'm very happy. And if my bhakta gives me something more than even the simplest thing, if my bhakta starts getting even more elaborate, then I'm even more pleased. So, on the one hand, it should be stressed that Bhagavan is satisfied with anything he's given, provided he's given it with bhakti. But at the same time, that then will say, so it doesn't matter what you cook or what you offer, nothing is significant, all that matters is bhakti. Not quite. In other words, the Kaimutya Nyaya being read here is that if Bhagavan is satisfied even with water, then if you give him something more than water, if you grow some flowers and offer him those flowers, then he'll be even more pleased. In other words, there is also a potential of scale and gradation in the content of what is being offered. But that said, this, can lead to a slippery slope where people think, let's make this and that, and we'll make this, and then suddenly we want to build skyscraper temples and all of this. And then to do that, you end up doing so many things that are contrary to the nature of bhakti in order to acquire those means. And then, is that pleasing to Bhagavan? As far as I'm concerned, no! In other words, Bhagavan is more pleased with water, that's given to him with bhakti than he is by any attempt at elaboration that erodes the purity of mind and the purity of the act on the part of the bhakta. That, yes, he's satisfied more so by some elaboration in the offering, but that's strictly provided that the integrity of one's own bhakti is not called into question or not soiled in the course of supposedly creating this more elaborate or better offering. So Sri Jivapad portrays Bhagavan Sri Krishna's intent in this verse as follows. Even when a bhakta is in a state of having nothing or being possessionless, if he has eagerness for my service, then a fragrance and so forth offered to me is most dear. What more needs to be said? That is, when even just a fragrance offered to me by my bhakta with Shraddha greatly pleases me, then it goes without saying that in combination with that incense, Flowers, lamps, food, and other so on are also all the more pleasing to me when they are offered to me by my bhakta with shraddha. This is the meaning. So, elaboration can have value if it doesn't in any way contradict the purity of the offerer or of the bhakti that's being expressed. This is the essential point of balance between the two sides of the analysis. All the offerings mentioned by the author in the verse under discussion are thus to be understood as instances in which Sri Bhagavan was greatly pleased by bhaktas, who expressed their bhakti in the form of the offerings of foods of various types. This can be clearly observed in the narrations of Srimad Bhagavatam and other texts that describe how each of these offerings were made to Sri Bhagavan and how Sri Bhagavan took pleasure in them. So from here, we'll go into some summary of each of the examples given in the verse, starting with the wives of the Brahmanas mentioned in the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam. And of course, we'll look at the passages in the Bhagavatam, we'll look at the way the commentators have illuminated them, and so forth, to get at what was going on there and why that expression of bhakti was so pleasing to Bhagavan. So, I conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share. All right, well, we can leave it at that for today, and we'll go further into this sublime subject, since for most bhaktas, making offerings to Bhagavan, praying that he be pleased with them, is a natural feature of daily sadhana practice. Then this type of discussion can bring some fresh reflection and enrichment to this essential feature of our daily life, and the profundity of even the simplicity in our daily life can be enriched by such discussion. So we pray that by engaging in this discussion, we may succeed in making offerings that are endearing to the heart of Bhagavan. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.